What is Koine Greek? Who should learn it and why? Those are the questions we're going to look at in this video. Let's get into it. So what exactly is Koine Greek, and should you bother learning it or not? Well, in this video, we're going to take a look at this question. This is really, it's kind of a history lesson, and it's also kind of a bit of a behind-the-scenes background, not to me, but to the language itself and where it came from. So I hope this is going to be useful for you. Before we get started, let me just encourage you to hit the like button and the subscribe button and hit the notify bell as well. That way when new videos like this are released, you'll be the first to know about it. So, the first question we have to answer here today is, what on earth is Koine Greek? Well, let's start by going back in time to a long time ago. About 2000 BC, we have this period of time when the Greek language started to compose itself, so to speak, and that's not really the way it happens because language comes from people, not itself, but you know what I'm saying. And it develops into a number of dialects. Now, in around about the 8th century BC, Homer, writing in one of these dialects, the Ionic dialect, he writes some of his writings, the Iliad and the Odyssey and things like that. This leads to the Ionic dialect growing in popularity until around the 5th century BC. Here's the thing, right? The Ionic dialect was part of Asia Minor, and in the 5th century BC, something very significant took place in Asia Minor that really prevented the Ionic dialect from taking over and becoming the lingua franca, the default language of the whole kind of world at the time in a way. And that was the Persian invasion. The Persians spread from east over toward the west, and they took over a lot of Asia Minor. Well, they took over the entire of Asia Minor, really, and they went as far as Greece itself. And they were stopped, as you probably know, at the Battle of Thermopylae by Athens working together with Sparta and some of those other southern groups. After the defeat of the Persian Empire, there was a period of time in which in Athens, who were one of the main players in that whole defeat really, there was a period of time in the 5th century where Athens went through this period of prosperity and peace, leading to the huge volume of writings from people like Thucydides, Aristotle, Plato, and some of these kinds of writers that we have today. Now, these writers all wrote in the Greek that Athens used, and that was what was called Attic Greek. Now, because these writings all have a very high literary quality, this Attic Greek has been dubbed Classical Greek. Okay, so when we talk about Classical Greek, we're talking about Attic Greek. They're both much the same thing. One of the things that took place around this time, though, was that Attic Greek ended up breaking into kind of two streams. It became standardized for the purpose of poetry and literature, and this became the ingrained classical Greek that we have today. And then there was the regular Greek, the popular level Greek that everybody on the street would just speak. The classical Greek, the Attic Greek, that literary Greek, that was standardized, which means it wasn't supposed to change. It was a standardized set of sounds and forms that were supposed to be used consistently. The popular level language was a language that was allowed to morph and change as the needs of the culture allowed. One thing we can take away from this is that even as early as the 4th and 5th centuries BC, people were squabbling over how Greek should be pronounced and how it should be spelt and the forms that it should take and those kind of things. You know, maybe there's something we can learn from this here today. Let me pause for a moment and share with you that this video is sponsored by Logos Bible Software. If you're interested in a dictionary that works through both classical, Attic that is, and Koine Greek, then I recommend to you the Dictionary of Ancient Greek by Brill. Now you can buy this on Logos Bible Software at mntg.me/Brill Dictionary. And if you don't already have a copy of Logos, you can go and get a copy of Logos Bible Software at mntg.me/Logos and get 50% off the Logos Fundamentals edition, as well as a few extra books. Now let's get back to those two forms of Greek that broke apart during that Attic period. During the 4th century AD, Macedonia rose to power under the rule of Philip II. Philip II was Alexander the Great's father. And so he rose to power and he established Attic Greek, that is the Greek of Athens, as the language for government and culture, not only in Greece itself, but also in Macedonia as well. And this began a period of the spreading of the language and also of the Greek culture, and this was known as Hellenization. Hellenization is the process essentially of taking the Greek language and culture and spreading it into non-Greek cultures and language areas as well. And so when Alexander the Great started his conquest to the east, and he started that in about 332 and carried on until about 324 BC, he took the Attic language, the Greek language, with him throughout all of those eastern areas, all the way through the Middle East, what we today call the Middle East, and all the way down into India as well. And so Greek, Attic Greek particularly, spread to all of these areas. And because of Alexander's work and because of the conquests he did, Attic Greek became the language of government and even of culture, and it became the language that every single place that he would conquer would end up having to work in, often first by reading and writing, but later on by speaking the language as well. And as that happened, the language changed, even as far as from one location to another, as different languages had different influences on the Greek language itself. So Koine Greek is this language, this Attic language that was spread throughout the world and subsequently simplified and spread from one culture to another as Alexander went through the world that he went through at that stage. And it stayed the main language of government and politics and culture from the time of Alexander all the way through really into the 2nd century AD and even into the 3rd century AD as well. This word koine just simply means common. It is the common language that was spread throughout the world at that stage. So Koine Greek is just common Greek. It is the least literary language of the Greco-Roman period, and really the least literary Greek language that has probably ever been in existence. And just as Attic Greek broke into this common kind of form, this popular form, and then a literary form as well that was kind of high and standardized, so too, even within Koine Greek, you end up getting this kind of division that starts to emerge as well. And again, the same sort of division takes place where the literary style, and this isn't a literary style used for poetry and literature like Attic Greek was, because that would still be where the authors would still use Attic Greek for that. For instance, Marcus Aurelius writes in Attic Greek, not in Koine Greek. But within the Koine sphere, there is still a slightly higher, more elevated form of Greek that is used for things like history, narratives, medicine, and more technical works like those. So this is more of a literary Koine, and then there's a rough Koine that just everybody on the street uses as well. The New Testament tends to be written in that general kind of everyday language kind of Koine, whereas things like the letter of Aristeas, which is how we get the legend of the Septuagint, that was written in that literary Koine Greek. So then what's the difference between Attic Greek and Koine Greek? Well, Rodney Decker, in the first chapter of his grammar, gives us this in 3 real broad brush strokes, and I think this is really helpful. The first one is that the words themselves change. So words from the culture that adopted Greek would grow into the Greek language, and they would modify those so that they borrowed words essentially from their own language and threw them into the Greek language. Sometimes they would just make up words, and sometimes they would modify words so that words that used to mean one thing came to mean something else. And this is all very organic, but one of the ways that Koine Greek differs from Attic Greek is the words themselves have different semantic ranges and meanings in Koine to what they have in Attic. Secondly, in Koine Greek, there is a number of syntactical changes that take place. For instance, me verbs, which were common in Attic Greek, begin to drop away and even get turned into omega-ending verbs. Certain other things, such as grammatical number, was simplified. So in the Attic period, you had singular, plural, and dual. And this is very similar to how you have it in Hebrew as well, for that matter. But in the Koine period, you just have singular and plural, and dual really just disappears. Similarly, optatives are on their way out. Future participles are largely not found in the Koine period as well. And all these are just different syntactical implications as the language itself simplifies and as things like the subjunctive replaces the optative and things like that. So some of these forms just get replaced with other forms, or they just get simplified so that it's easier for non-native speakers to be able to understand one another as they talk together. They just simplify the language to make that easier. Thirdly, the language of the Koine period is much more explicit. So some of the nuances that a native speaker would have are lost to non-native speakers. And so therefore the language itself is simplified. It's become more explicit. So you find a lot more uses of things like prepositions and pronouns. And then you find a lot less use of cases to provide prepositional understandings. For instance, the dative case is used a lot less often in the Koine period to what it's used in the Attic period. So these are some of the key areas that we find changes between the Koine period and the Attic period. The words themselves change, the grammar is simplified, and also the language is made more explicit by using things like prepositions and pronouns and things like that. So what happened to Koine Greek? Well, at the end of the 4th century, Rome broke into the Eastern and Western empires, and while the Eastern Empire retained Greek as its language, the Western Empire started to use Latin more and more, and eventually Greek sort of dropped away. Now in the Eastern Empire, what happens there was we enter into what's called the Byzantine era of Greek. This is called Byzantine Greek, and so that language goes from about that 400-ish mark all the way through to 1453 when the city of Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. And from that point on, we get into the period which is largely regarded as modern Greek, and it's during this modern Greek period that we finally see this literary Greek and the common Greek sort of merge together, and really that's the common Greek that becomes the popular Greek that we have today, and that was only in the 1970s. So that's where Koine Greek came from, and a little bit about where it ended up going as well. So what texts have been written in Koine Greek that we can take a hold of and read today? And by Koine Greek, again, here I'm referring to that period from 300 BC through to about 300 AD, okay? And that common language element. What's been written in that common language? Well, of course, the most impactful of all the writings written in Koine Greek is the New Testament itself. But not just the New Testament, really, the Septuagint, which was translated from the Hebrew scriptures and Aramaic scriptures into Koine Greek as well. These are probably the most important texts written in the Koine dialect. Now, on top of that, of course, we have the Apostolic Fathers. These were those who continued speaking, reading, and writing Greek from the 1st century all the way through to about the 3rd or 4th century. And again, where the church splits into East and West, you know, with the Roman Empire, you tend to have a division of languages. So, for instance, the West tends to start going Latin, and the East sort of stays Greek, but then goes into that Byzantine Greek anyway. So, most of that period, from about 1st century through to the 3rd century, this is the period we sometimes refer to as the Apostolic Fathers. These men wrote in Koine Greek, although over time it tended toward that more literary style as time went on, and hence in the Byzantine period it became a kind of a literary form in its own right. There are, though, some other texts that have been written in Koine Greek. For instance, Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, wrote his histories and wars in Koine Greek. We also have writings from people like Philo, who was a Jewish philosopher, as well as a number of other philosophers, not necessarily Jewish ones. Epictetus, for instance, was a Stoic philosopher, wrote in Koine Greek. We also have medical journals and writings for the likes of Galen, and there's some satire by Lucian, and there may be one or two others as well. And there's a few other writings in Koine Greek as well that we can get a hold of. And so who should read Koine Greek? Well, here's the thing. If you have more than a passing interest in the Bible, then you really want to learn to read the New Testament in the language that God inspired it in, and that the everyday people were speaking in that day. And in there we get an understanding of the worldview, the core assumptions of that culture, and we can see that embedded in the text much more clearly. Not only that, but we can read the text with a great deal more clarity as well. So Koine Greek is fundamentally important if you're interested in biblical writings at all, and not just the New Testament, but also the Septuagint, and beyond that to the interpretation of the New Testament under the Apostolic Fathers as well. Hugely important for these groups. So if you're interested in the Bible at all, Koine Greek is something you should seriously consider learning. But if you wanted to look at any of the texts of the first century and just get your head around a little bit of what was the culture like, how did they think, what was their worldview, then any of these writings will be really helpful when you study Koine Greek to understand exactly how they did think and how they did communicate. And so there are 4 reasons I normally give people to consider reading the New Testament, particularly in biblical Greek. And here's what they are. First up, clarity. And I've mentioned all of these somewhere else, so I'm just going to leave a link to that up here if you want a bit more detail on these. But clarity, first of all. There's nothing like reading the original writings of the New Testament in the language that the authors intended to write in. Secondly, confidence. When you can see clearly what they wrote, you have a lot more confidence that what you're able to say about those writings is true. Reading them in a translation really undermines the clarity and the message of those texts in a lot of ways, because you just can't bring things through a translation without losing a lot. And there is really a lot lost. And it's really that detail and that nuance that we lose today. Thirdly is vitality. If we are reading the New Testament in the original language, of course, it's going to benefit our own soul. And finally, it's going to make us more efficient and more effective as messengers of the New Testament, as disciples of Christ. So these 4 reasons, clarity, confidence, vitality, and efficiency, really will make a huge difference, not only to you, but to your life and to your ministry as well. And that's why I teach Master New Testament Greek, and why we go through many of the writings in the Koine period, particularly the Septuagint and the Apostolic Fathers, as well as the New Testament. So if you're interested in more information about that, head to masterntgreek.com/roadmap to download my roadmap to mastery today. And let me just say to you, thank you so much for watching this video and any of these videos, and I hope to see you again real soon. We'll see you then.